Hello and welcome to this video 1 for weeks 8 to 9 of language learning and wellbeing. This week we're looking at representations of communication disorders. As we move through the lecture, I'm going to encourage you to reflect on whether or not disorder is an appropriate term or not, thinking back to many of the things that we've discussed on the module in relation to deficit models, and thinking about whether or not the areas of communication and the different pathologies that we're going to discuss today are really an issue of disorder or whether they're an issue of difference. And in Susan Anderson's week, in a couple of weeks' time, she's going to really delve into this particular issue, but something that I would encourage you to think about as we move through the session today as well. So we're going to, in this first video, look at a particular form of communication disorder or communication difference, which is stutters and stammers. Stutters and stammers are quite a common version of speech disorder. I'm going to use that term as we move through, but again, as I say, I would encourage you to reflect on its appropriacy as we move through the session. Something that is very common and much more common in children, and often something that people will grow out of as they get older. I'm going to talk to you about that in more detail in a moment. But something which, as a result of this, is a communication disorder which is quite often represented in fiction, in both films and books, and something which has been commented upon in lots of research about the ways in which stutters and stammers are often used in quite problematic ways. And Baskin and Harris talk about this, and this is reflected in Logan et al., which is one of the options that you have for the reading this week if this is a topic that you're interested in, thinking in particular about YA or young adult fiction. And this is what Logan and colleagues say. They say Baskin and Harris lamented that, in the books they reviewed, disabilities were rarely presented as an unremarkable feature of a character's being. This pattern remains true in contemporary stuttering-related juvenile fiction. That is, in the books reviewed here, stuttering was generally presented as a significant problem for the affected characters. And it's probably a good moment for me to mention that typically stuttering and stammering refer to the same communication disorder. It tends to be in the American literature that people will prefer the term stutter, and in British literature they tend to prefer the term stammer. But we are talking about the same thing. So what is stammering or stuttering? I'm going to prefer the term stammering, given that it's typically the British term. Now, stammering is something which tends to have one of two ways in which the communication disorder is acquired. The first one is a developmental stammer, which is sometimes called an idiopathic stammer. And these are the types of stammers that typically occur in early childhood when speech and language skills are rapidly developing. So it will be something that will become noticeable, will become manifest as a young person acquires language and learns to talk. There is also a second type of stammering which is much rarer, and that is acquired or late onset stammering. This typically occurs in older children and adults and is normally the result of some sort of accident, so typically a head injury, possibly a stroke, or some sort of neurological condition. So generally speaking, a stammer will be something which a young person has, which they develop as they learn to speak, and in these very rare instances can be something which is acquired later in life. They can, interestingly, also be caused by certain drugs and medications, may have stammering as a side effect, and can also be caused by psychological or emotional trauma. The stammer representations that I'm going to look at with you today fall into this first and more common category of developmental stammers. But the way in which they manifest in language production are very similar. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the characteristics of stammering, and you will tend to find that whether or not somebody has a developmental or a late onset stammer, that the particular characteristics that it possesses in terms of how they communicate will tend to be the same. And I'm going to show you some examples of that as we move through this session. So what is a stammer? A stammer manifests in various forms and is generally spoken about in terms of disfluency in verbal language production. So disfluency is something where there are problems with particular words or phrases, and somebody would be characterised as having language which is disfluent, which is not coherently put together. There may be pauses, maybe particular sounds or particular words that people will struggle with. And most commonly it's thought of as phoneme. So if you remember back to first year describing language, a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound that we can discuss. It's the smallest unit that we can break language up into. So it's either a phoneme repetition, so repeating a particular sound over and over and being unable to get to the next one, or sometimes a single syllable repetition. So we might think about someone saying cat or cat category. Both of these are very typical manifestations of a stammer. That's the sort of dysfluency that's being referred to. It can also include elongation of a phoneme, so people sticking on an elongate, so saying things like rabbit, or a complete inability to get a word out. And people who have stammers will often describe this process where that may result in, linguistically, in pausing for a long time as an inability to start the word at all. Typically, this elongation as well is also a sort of manifestation of this inability to get the next word or the next sound out. And so rather than repeating it, you find that sometimes people with a stammer will stick on that particular phoneme for an elongated period of time. Here's another definition for you, a little bit more of a technical one. This is from Gordon, 2002. And he says, stuttering or stammering, as it is referred to, is a developmental speech disorder which usually appears in children ages between 3 and 8 years old. More than often it remits, it disappears before puberty, but it can persist into adult life. Stuttering is characterised by involuntary syllable repetition, syllable prolongations, extensions, or interruptions, blocks in the smooth flow of speech. So these are the three things that we're really talking about when we're thinking about stuttering. Particularly interesting, I think, to think about the fact that this is something which typically goes away for most people. Will grow out of a stammer, it will abate as they get older. But interesting to think about how, when these are the first interactions of people learning to use language and communicate with others, about the long-term impact that this may have in perhaps being quieter, perhaps being more introverted, as a result of having had difficulties with getting words out and interacting in earlier life. So why do people stammer? Well, interestingly, we're not entirely sure. We know that it's neurological, it's something to do with the brain, but it can also be hugely affected by environmental factors such as embarrassment, pressure, or stress. So sometimes people will have a stammer which is barely noticeable, but when they're then put in an uncomfortable or high-stress situation, the stammer or stutter will get worse and become very, very manifest. There is some suggestion that there is a genetic predisposition for stammers, and we know this because it appears to be to run in families. It appears to be somewhat hereditary. So 70% of those who develop a stammer will have a relative who also stammers, and there is also a concordance. So that means that there's sort of a pattern in studies of identical twins that if one has a stammer, there is a 75 to 89% chance that the other person will have, the other twin will have a stammer as well, which suggests again that it's something which is genetically predisposed. Interestingly, again, we don't know the reasons why for this, but men are significantly more likely to develop a stammer than women, a ratio of about 3 to 4 to 1. So for every four people who have a stammer, 3 of them are likely to be men and only 1 is likely to be a woman. Stammers are relatively common. They affect approximately 1% of the population, so around 1 in 100 people will have a stammer, but around 40% of children who have them will grow out of their stammer and make a full recovery within 1 year. So often we're talking about only a very short period of a child's life where they will experience this issue, and then in particular, obviously, if there is medical intervention, if there's speech and language therapy and support, it will be something which abates relatively rapidly. Most stammers are mild to moderate, though this is quite interesting, and those of you who are interested in this area, I would really encourage you to read the Jordan and et al. Study. That fictional representations of stammers, and when stammers are covered in the press and documentaries, tend to skew towards much more extreme versions. So whilst 1% of the population will have a stammer at some point in their lives, it tends to be something which is quite short-lived and tends to be mild to moderate, but that is not necessarily reflected in the representations that we get that both in fiction and in non-fiction. So developmental stammers, these ones that are onset around the ages of 3 to 8, are not caused by trauma. However, there does seem to be a an interaction with trauma in terms of traumatic experiences can prompt the onset of a stammer in an individual who already has a genetic predisposition. So in other words, it's not traumatic experiences that can cause a stammer, but if you have a hereditary predisposition that you may develop a stammer, then experiencing a traumatic event in early childhood can be the thing which prompts its onset, causes it to manifest. It could be down to a mismatch between language knowledge and motor capacity. This is something which would offer some degree of explanation as to why it manifests in children and also why it tends to disappear. That language knowledge is perhaps sometimes slightly ahead of the developments in motor capacity of being able to control various areas of the tongue and the mouth that are used to produce sounds. Equally, it could be a deficit in articulatory planning capacity. That's just a fancy way of saying being able to think about what it is that you're going to say as you're trying to say it. So it could be that for some young people, their ability to want to speak is slightly quicker than their brain's current ability to form coherent sentences and work out what it is that they want to say. And this can result in this sort of disfluency where there are lots of pauses and stammers whilst this is being worked out by the brain in order to catch up. It could be something to do with auditory processing. So we know, and those of you who have ever seen The King's Speech will have seen this represented very accurately in the film, and is actually a real thing. We know that if we interfere with auditory feedback, so if you, for instance, put headphones on somebody with a stammer and ask them to speak, that the stammer will disappear. And it's difficult for us to understand why this might be, but it suggests that there's something possibly going on in the feedback, the sounds that they're receiving, that by disrupting causes the stammer to disappear. There are neurological differences in stammerers, but the research is very unclear about whether that is cause or effect. So what that essentially means is if you put someone with a stammer into a CT scanner, into an MRI scanner and scan their brain, you can observe differences in the brains of people who have stammers compared to people who don't. However, it's unclear whether or not these differences were always there and have resulted in this person having a stammer, or whether as a result of having a stammer it has created differences in the brain. So we're not quite sure in which direction that works. Interesting, especially on this module, for us to reflect on the relationship between stammering and mental well-being. So we know that stammers are not caused by stress or anxiety. However, and I think this is quite obvious if we reflect on it, if you have a stammer, this will often provoke feelings of stress and anxiety, in particular in contexts in which you're being expected to speak. So things like answering the phone, very commonly this, or being asked to speak in front of groups of people, particularly if they're strangers or unfamiliar, thinking about needing to ask directions from somebody when you're late, can provoke feelings of stress and anxiety, and we know that stress and anxiety are things which can make a stammer much worse. So there is an unfortunate sort of cyclical relationship between these two things. So in other words, another way of thinking about this is fear of the stammer can cause the stammer to manifest and get worse. And we see this with other disorders as well, things like Tourette's syndrome, very commonly known to manifest in form of various tics, some of which are verbal and some of which are non-verbal, but we know that stress and anxiety can exacerbate those tics and cause them to become more apparent and more frequent. From a communication point of view, this is interesting because we know that stammerers can then develop issues such as word or situational avoidance. Word avoidance is if there are particular words, particular sounds that a stammerer struggles with, they will consciously or unconsciously start to avoid contexts in which they need to use that word. This may mean that they use a different word, or it may mean that they avoid situations in which they're going to have to say these particular words. Situational avoidance, something which from a social point of view and a well-being point of view can be much more serious, is avoiding situations which may provoke stress and anxiety, things like contexts in which someone is knows they're going to be asked to speak. So we may find that someone with a stammer, for instance, refuses to answer a phone because that's a situational avoidance. This thing, by not answering the phone, you're not going to be put in a situation in which you're expected to talk, which is going to provoke stress and anxiety, which is likely to make your stammer worse. This is not helped, so from a well-being point of view, is often made worse by a reduced capacity to estimate time, and feelings of pressure to speak can be escalated by overestimation of periods of silence. So this is quite an interesting study that suggests that people with stammers perceive time as being more extended, longer than it actually is. So if you ask somebody to speak and they pause before they start to speak, and then you ask someone with a stammer to estimate how long that period of time was, they're likely to give you a longer estimation than somebody without a stammer. So where somebody without a stammer may say, I think that was about 3 seconds, someone with a stammer is more likely to say, I think that was 6 or 7 seconds. And again, you can see, hopefully, that makes a lot of sense if you were feeling this kind of pressure to speak, if it's something which prompts stress and anxiety, and you know something that dysfluency is something that you struggle with, that you're more likely to exacerbate that. It's more likely to feel like a longer time because of the stress that is provoked as a result of that experience, that set of experiences. So it's a very embodied kind of feeling of time as being elongated. We also know that experiences of negative listener response can make symptoms worse. So these are things like when people react in a manner which is unhelpful, so perceived impatience or actual impatience, people finishing words and sentences for someone with a stammer. It can often be something that people feel like they're doing that's going to be helpful, but is likely actually to just make the stammer worse because it feels like the person is being impatient or getting annoyed with that person's attempt to communicate. So from a linguistic point of view, all sorts of really interesting things that we could think about how this may affect people's communication patterns when they have a stammer compared to people who don't. Jordan et al. Did a really interesting study of this where they reviewed lots and lots of young adult fiction that looked at representations of stammers, and these are some of their key findings. They said that in nearly all books, stuttered speech, this is an American study, so that's why they're using the term stutter, stammered speech was represented in whole or part-through repetitions of sounds, syllables within words. Reliance upon repeated speech as a symptom of stuttering reflects the challenges inherent in representing the acoustic properties of dysfluency. So in other words, when authors of fiction are trying to represent a stammer, there are aspects of it which they find easier to represent and aspects which they find more difficult to convey to the reader that this person is somebody who's suffering with a stammer. And we're going to look in a few moments at some examples of real stuttered speech, and you'll be able to see some of the things which are easier and more difficult to represent. And in one of the tasks that you're looking at this week, we're going to look at a fictional representation of a stammer from Stephen King's novel It, and you'll be able to have a go at looking at how that stammer's been represented and thinking about how accurate it is in terms of what stammering and stammered speech actually looks like. So they found that very few texts contain any depiction of what speech and language therapy activity might actually look like. So often stammers are represented either as things that go away on their own, things that are associated with traumatic events or stressful situations. But what's often not represented in these texts, even when they're texts when people recover from stammers, is a representation of what the medical interventions might look like. And Jordan et al. Kind of problematise this and say, is this an appropriate thing to be giving to young people, especially if we're thinking about young people with stammers who may be reading this kind of fiction, that we're not sort of presenting medical interventions as things that are necessarily helpful, because they tend to be omitted from those narratives. This next quotation I think very interesting. They say many of the characters were depicted, at least in the initial stages of the story, as isolated, unsure and unhappy. Most often stuttering was one of several challenges the character faced, which allowed authors to demonstrate how the disorder affects and is affected by other aspects of daily life. So not just thinking about the stammer as something in isolation, but thinking about it being represented as interacting with lots of other kind of environmental, social and developmental sort of pressures. And they found that many characters who are represented as having stammers exhibit word and situation avoidance, which is something that we know from the last slide is something which is an accurate representation of a stammer. Circumlocution, so finding a longer way around saying something, often to avoid a particular word. And word substitution, which is again a practice which is quite commonly used in speech and language therapy activities to treat stammers, where if there are particular sounds or particular words that people struggle with, that they will find a substitution, in particular if it's a common word that people are going to be asked to use a lot, that it makes a lot more sense to just avoid using that particular word and substitute it for a different one. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty of this then. These are the characteristics of stammering. So these are the things that we know that when we actually go and examine stammered speech are the things that people will tend to have issues with in relation to different parts of communication. So we know that people are more likely to stammer on words that carry information, so lexical rather than grammatical words. So things like the, and, your conjunctions, things like that. Your articles tend to be things that people don't struggle with. It tends to be your lexical words, your nouns, your verbs, that people will have more difficulty with. We know that people are more likely to stammer on complex words of several syllables, so the longer the word is, the more likely it is that people may struggle with it, whereas single syllable words tend to present less of an issue. We know that people are more likely to stammer at the start of sentences rather than mid-sentence or near the end of it. We know that people are more likely to stammer on word initial or syllable initial phonemes. So they will tend to struggle with the start of a word, and I've represented that for you visually here, rather than middle bits or end bits. It tends to be at the start, whether that's the initial phoneme, the initial sound, or whether that's the initial syllable, will tend to be where the issue is likely to arise. Stammering typically, interestingly, and we don't really understand why this is, but doesn't tend to affect singing, whispering, or speaking in chorus. Speaking in chorus may be something to do with the audio feedback and disruption to audio feedback that I discussed slightly earlier and is represented quite well in the King's Speech. Singing and whispering, we're not quite sure why, but there is something about that which appears to disrupt a stammer. So you will sometimes see that people who struggle with a stammer might try and sing something or whisper something as a method of being able to get those words out, or to disrupt the stammer and cause it to stop. And we know that stammering is more likely to be prevalent in situations of pressure or stress, whether that is from a pressure to speak itself, especially if it's a time-sensitive context. So if there's a short period in which someone's going to be asked to do something. So we know, for example, that first picking up a phone and that initial saying hello, beginning to speak, can be more likely to cause a stammer to manifest, because the person will worry that if they don't say something that the other person may think there's not somebody on the end of the phone, whereas once they're mid-conversation, the stammer is likely to be less prevalent. Or indeed fear of particular words or certain scenarios. So I'm going to play you now an example of this. And this is some stammered speech. This is from a repository that UCL have, University College London, who have done a big study of this. And what I'd really encourage you to do is perhaps go back to the previous slide. As you're having a listen to this, I would listen to it a couple of times, perhaps follow along on the transcript initially. But just see if you can spot some of these patterns manifesting, these things that I've just discussed here. Can you identify these characteristics in this issue of stammered speech? So I'm going to play it for you now.
I'm at St John's now, doing my AS levels. I'm doing 4, which is a change because normally 3. I'm doing maths, IT, art, physics, all of which I can't stand except art. That's still got loads of work that I've got to have done by the start of the term, which is a bit worrying. Physics isn't that bad, but we've got this teacher who's so boring. He could just sort of semi-sleeping during every single class because he obviously can't stay awake. So you do sort of approach death most of the time with your heart slowing down and everything. It's just his consciousness. Maths is getting quite hard. I mean, last year it was all fine, but now we're learning loads of new stuff every day, and the workload is huge at the moment, so that's quite worrying, seeing as we've got exams coming up. Art's quite fun though, because it's not really that intense, so it's quite good. Although I still got to do quite a bit on that. So, yeah. 4 is 4 is 4. 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 4 is 4 okay, but it can be really dull talking about sort of sounds from inputs, outputs of computers and everything. That bit's a bit too technical, really. Other than that, it's fine. So,
Okay, so really interesting then for us to go back and reflect on the characteristics of stammering that is prevalent or not in this particular young man's speech. And just interesting for you to reflect, I think, on the fact that some of the patterns of his stammer that we can observe in this particular excerpt of his speech do cohere with these characteristics, and some of them don't. So we will see, for example, that he does tend to stammer on lexical rather than grammatical words. That definitely fits the pattern. Tends to be in some places nearer the start of sentences, but not always. So interesting to observe that as a distinction, a difference. Definitely a tendency to stammer on word initial or syllable initial phonemes, but not always. So we can see this bit where he's trying to say the word approach, that there is a bit of difficulty at the end rather than the beginning of the word. Interesting too to reflect on whether or not there is any sort of coherence in the topics that he's discussing or not. I think that's something which could be open to discussion there. Tends, interestingly, for this young man to not be, it seems, longer, more multisyllable words. Actually, in many examples here, it is single syllable words which he appears to study on. So it is not the case that all stammers are created equal, and interesting, I think, to observe those particular characteristics. So I hope you found this an interesting overview of stammers and how they tend to affect speech, and some reflections about how they may impact on somebody's communication patterns and their willingness or unwillingness to communicate in different contexts. The task today is going to be associated with looking at a fictional representation of a stammer, and I would really encourage you to carry forward some of the knowledge that I have given you about stammers to your examination of that particular text. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the second video.